the German Navy's secret mutiny that shocked Hitler. In the final months of the Second World War, Hitler's empire was collapsing from within. Cities lay in ruins, the skies burned red with Allied firebombs, and across Europe, the Nazi war machine was being crushed from every direction. Yet among the chaos and defeat, a different kind of battle was quietly beginning, one that would not be fought with tanks or bombs, but with conscience. In the cold naval ports of northern Germany, sailors of the Kriegsmarine waited for orders. They were the last remnants of a once mighty navy that had once ruled the seas with fear and precision. Now they stood surrounded by the sound of distant artillery and the eerie silence that comes when hope has already died. They knew the war was lost. Everyone did. But still, the orders kept coming. Orders to fight, to die, to destroy. Among these sailors was a 23-year-old radio operator named Matthias Kessler. His uniform was worn, his eyes hollow, and his hands trembled as he decoded a message from Berlin. The message bore a single word that would change everything: Regenbogen, rainbow. It was the code name for Operation Rainbow, Hitler's final naval order. The command was simple and absolute. Every German warship still afloat was to be destroyed before it could fall into Allied hands. Every submarine, every destroyer, every vessel scuttled, sunk, erased from existence. For the officers who still worshipped the Führer, it was an honorable end, a way to deny the enemy their victory. But to the men who had spent years risking their lives aboard those ships, it was madness. They had seen enough death, enough senseless sacrifice. They knew that by following this order, they would be condemning themselves and their comrades to die for a cause that no longer existed. Kessler read the message twice, then 3 times. Around him, the room was silent except for the hum of the radio. His commanding officers signed the order without hesitation. But something inside Kessler broke. He thought of his brother killed on the Eastern Front, his mother who had died in an air raid, the comrades who had been lost to the freezing Atlantic. For what? For an empire that was already dust.
Outside, the docks were a ghost town of steel and smoke. Ships sat moored in the harbor, silent and still. Their crews waited for orders they did not want to follow. Some whispered that surrender was coming, that the war would end in days. Others warned that any man who disobeyed an order from Berlin would be shot for treason. And so, in that heavy silence, the men began to make a choice. Aboard the destroyer Z-43, Lieutenant Otto Bauer gathered his men in the engine room. He spoke quietly, his voice shaking. "The war is over," he said. "We all know it. Berlin is burning. There is no reason to die now." The men looked at one another, torn between fear and relief. They had served under him for years. They had trusted him in storms, in battles, in moments of pure terror. And now, once more, they trusted him. That night, the first whispers of rebellion began to move through the fleet. Sailors refused to load ammunition. Engines were left cold. Messages were delayed, changed, or simply never sent. The rebellion did not begin with gunfire. It began with silence.
As night fell over Kiel, a single signal light blinked across the harbor. 3 short flashes, 2 long, then 1 short. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than routine communication. But to those who knew, it was the sign they had been waiting for, the signal of defiance. The mutiny had begun. The signal lights cut through the night like sparks of rebellion. 3 short flashes, 2 long, 1 short. It was small, almost invisible against the fog drifting across the harbor, but for those who watched from the decks of their ships, it was everything. It was the beginning. On board the destroyer Z-43, Lieutenant Otto Bauer stood with his men in the engine room, their faces lit by the dull orange glow of lanterns. The air smelled of oil and rust, heavy with anticipation. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The decision had already been made. At exactly midnight, Bauer gave a simple order: cut the power. The engines fell silent. The vibrations that had lived within the ship for years, the heartbeat of steel, vanished. Above deck, officers shouted, confused by the sudden blackout. But before anyone could react, the sailors moved. They locked the hatches, sealed the bridge, and took control. Within minutes, Z-43 was no longer under command of the Reich. It was under the command of its crew. For the first time in years, they were free men. Across the harbor, the same thing was happening. On the cruiser Prince Eugen, sailors refused to man their guns. On a U-boat preparing to dive, the chief engineer destroyed the ignition keys and declared the submarine unfit for combat. And in a small coastal patrol ship, a young captain threw his sidearm into the sea, saying only, "No more orders from ghosts." The mutiny spread like wildfire, quietly, invisibly, dangerously. Word traveled from ship to ship through whispers, through hand signals, through glances exchanged in the dark. Each man understood what was at stake. If they failed, they would be executed. But if they succeeded, they might live long enough to see the end of the war. By dawn, the port of Kiel was no longer a place of obedience. It was a powder keg.
When the officers realized what was happening, it was already too late. Some tried to rally the loyalists, to retake control by force. But the sailors had the advantage. They were everywhere, and they knew the ships better than anyone. Engines were sabotaged, communication lines cut, ammunition hidden or thrown overboard. Within hours, entire vessels were immobilized. In the command building overlooking the harbor, Admiral Hans Reuter received a call that made his blood run cold. "Sir," said the officer on the other end, "the Z-43 is no longer responding to orders. The men have taken the ship." Reuter froze. A mutiny? Here, in the Kriegsmarine? It was unthinkable. He barked into the receiver, demanding to know who was responsible. The answer came after a long pause. "All of them, sir. The entire crew." For a moment, the admiral said nothing. Then he hung up and stared out the window at the fog-covered sea. Somewhere out there, the navy he had spent his life building was tearing itself apart. Meanwhile, Kessler sat in his radio bunker, intercepting frantic messages from one ship after another. Some begged for help. Others cursed their men as traitors. One message sent from a loyal destroyer ended abruptly with a single word: fire. Gunfire echoed across the docks. The first blood of the mutiny had been spilled. Aboard the Z-43, Bauer heard the distant reports and knew the rebellion could not stay hidden any longer. He gathered his men on deck. "Listen to me," he said, his voice rising above the wind. "What we've done tonight, we've done for one reason: to live. Not to betray Germany, but to save what's left of it. The war is over, but our conscience is not. Remember that." Some nodded. Others stared at the sea, unable to speak. The enormity of what they had done pressed down on them like the weight of the ocean itself.
As the sun rose over the harbor, the full scale of the mutiny came into view. Nearly a dozen ships were now in the hands of their crews. Flags of the Reich hung lifeless in the wind, untouched. The harbor that had once echoed with drills and commands now stood eerily silent, save for the cry of gulls circling overhead. In Berlin, the reports began to reach the Führer bunker. Hitler's staff dismissed them at first as Allied propaganda, lies meant to sow confusion. But when confirmation came from the Navy High Command itself, panic followed. Hitler's rage was immediate and absolute. He screamed that the Navy was filled with cowards, that traitors had infected even the heart of the rank. He ordered that every man involved be executed without trial, but by then, control was already lost. In Kiel, a small band of sailors made a desperate choice. They would not surrender to Hitler's SS. They would not flee. They would hold their ground until the Allies arrived. And if the Gestapo came for them, they would fight back, not as Nazis, not as soldiers, but as men who had chosen freedom over fear. That night, the first Gestapo trucks rolled into the naval base. Black uniforms stepped out into the mist, their boots echoing on the docks. The hunt for the mutineers had begun. And deep in the radio bunker, Matthias Kessler whispered into the transmitter, sending a coded message not to Berlin, but to the approaching Allied forces. A message that would change everything. He spoke quietly, with steady hands, and when it was done, he leaned back and exhaled for the first time in days. The message was short, only 5 words.
By dawn, a heavy fog blanketed the harbor. The world seemed drained of color. Gray ships against gray water, their reflections swallowed by mist. For a few fragile hours, the mutineers believed they had bought themselves peace. But peace, in Hitler's Germany, was an illusion that never lasted. The first sign of trouble came with the low growl of truck engines. The Gestapo had arrived. Black uniformed officers poured into the docks like shadows given form. They moved with ruthless precision, weapons drawn, eyes sharp, faces blank. Their orders were simple: find the ringleaders, crush the rebellion, and make an example of every man who dared question the Führer's command. Matthias Kessler heard the trucks long before he saw them. From his radio bunker, he could feel the vibrations through the concrete floor. He turned off the transmitter and hid the coded log beneath a loose floor panel. The message had already gone out. The Allies would receive it soon, if they hadn't already. But now came the hard part: surviving long enough for it to matter. He looked at his reflection in the small metal mirror nailed to the wall. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale from exhaustion. He wasn't a hero, he told himself. He was just tired of death. Outside, on the destroyer Z-43, Lieutenant Bauer stood on the deck, watching the Gestapo trucks roll in. He knew what they were here for. They'll start with the officers, he murmured to his men. They'll want to know who gave the order. They'll torture the truth out of someone. One of the sailors swallowed hard. What do we do? Bauer stared out at the horizon, where faint flashes of artillery could be seen in the distance, the Soviets drawing closer with each passing hour. He said, "We hold the line, and if we can't, then we make sure they never get the ships." That morning, the Gestapo moved methodically from ship to ship, demanding answers. Those who cooperated were beaten. Those who didn't were shot on sight. The docks became a silent battlefield, a place where loyalty and fear collided in every glance, every breath.
At noon, Admiral Reuter was summoned from his office. He was furious, not at the mutineers, but at the chaos. He ordered immediate arrests, declaring martial law within the port. Posters went up overnight. Any man refusing orders will be executed. But the threat no longer had meaning. The men had already crossed the line. Once you defied Hitler, death was no longer the worst thing that could happen. By evening, smoke began to rise from the far end of the harbor. The Gestapo had discovered the first rebel stronghold, a warehouse where mutineers had stored food and medical supplies. They surrounded it, shouting for the men inside to surrender. But instead of surrendering, the sailors opened fire. The first exchange of gunfire between German soldiers and German sailors echoed across the harbor like thunder. The mutiny was no longer secret. It was war. Inside the warehouse, Bauer's men fought desperately, using overturned crates for cover. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but not broken. "They'll kill us all," one shouted. "Then we take as many of them as we can," Bauer replied, loading his rifle. Meanwhile, Kessler slipped through the back streets of Kiel, keeping to the shadows. He could hear the gunfire in the distance and knew the mutiny was collapsing. But his mission wasn't over. The Allies had to receive the message. If they knew the fleet would not resist, they could take the ports without bloodshed. He moved quickly, ducking through alleyways, heading toward a small transmitter hidden in the ruins of an old church. Inside the crumbling nave, Kessler found another sailor, an old friend named Franz Muller, waiting beside the backup radio. Muller had a deep gash on his forehead and blood on his sleeve. "I thought you were dead." "Not yet," Kessler replied. "We need to resend the signal, stronger this time." They worked in silence, their fingers moving over the dials and switches. Outside, artillery thundered from the outskirts of the city. The Allies were closer now, close enough that the ground itself trembled with every blast. Finally, the signal went out again, a single repeating code pulsing into the airwaves. "The German fleet will not fight. The ports are open."
Then the door burst open. 2 Gestapo officers stormed in, guns raised. Müller turned, shouting for Kessler to run, but the shots came too fast. Müller fell instantly, a dark stain spreading across the stone floor. Kessler ducked behind the console, his ears ringing. He grabbed the transmitter, ripped out the coil, and smashed the glass tube with the butt of his pistol. The room went dark. Footsteps approached. "Hands up!" one of the officers shouted. But when they stepped closer, they found the room empty. Kessler had vanished into the shadows. Outside, night had fallen again. Flames licked the sky above the harbor. The Z-43 was burning, the Prinzeugen listing heavily to one side. The Kriegsmarine, the pride of the Reich, was eating itself alive. In Berlin, Hitler received the final report just after midnight. Entire squadrons were refusing to fight. Several ships had been sabotaged. The Kiel harbor was in chaos. His hand shook as he read, "Cowards, they will all hang." But there was no time left for executions. The Soviets were already on the outskirts of the capital. The world was closing in. In the chaos of those final days, no one knew what became of Matthias Kessler. Some said he escaped, surrendering to the British near Lübeck. Others claimed he was captured and executed in secret, his name erased from every record. But one thing was certain, his message had reached its destination. When Allied forces entered the German ports days later, they found ships abandoned, flags lowered, and men waiting to surrender without resistance. The German fleet had stood down. And though few would ever know his name, Kessler's signal had saved thousands of lives, German and Allied alike.
The mutiny had failed to overthrow Hitler, but it had done something far greater. It had proven that even in the darkest heart of the Reich, conscience still existed. When the smoke cleared over Kiel, the harbor looked like the aftermath of a nightmare. Ships that had once gleamed with discipline and precision now floated half-submerged in oily water. Some burned silently, their flames reflected in the waves like dying embers. Others lay abandoned, hatches open, decks scattered with rifles, boots, and blood. The mutiny had lasted less than 48 hours, but in that short time it had done what no Allied bombing raid could. It had shattered the last illusion of unity within Hitler's war machine. At dawn, a soft rain began to fall, washing the ash from the air. Lieutenant Otto Bowers stood on what remained of the Z-43's deck, staring at the gray horizon. His men were gone, some killed in the fighting,
others captured by the Gestapo. The ship itself was dying, listing heavily to port, its hull torn open by shell fire. The smell of smoke, salt, and death hung heavy in the air. He thought of what they had tried to do, of the moment they had dared to say no to orders that made no sense. He wondered if it had been worth it. He looked down at his reflection in the slick black water and saw not a soldier, not a traitor, but something in between. A man caught between duty and decency, between what he had been told to be and what he knew was right. Behind him, the crack of rifle fire echoed from the docks. The Gestapo were still hunting the survivors, but Bauer didn't run. He had made his peace. As the sound drew closer, he whispered a single word under his breath. Enough. Then he turned and walked toward the shore. Elsewhere in the city, Matthias Kessler moved through the ruins like a ghost. He hadn't slept in 2 days. His uniform was torn, his face smeared with soot. The radio in his pack was silent now, its battery dead, but it didn't matter. The message was out. He had heard the faint reply before the Gestapo found him. The Allies had received it. He crossed through streets littered with rubble, past crumbling buildings and abandoned vehicles. The sky above was a dull gray, filled with the distant rumble of artillery. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the war was ending.
In Berlin, Hitler sat in his bunker, staring at maps that no longer mattered. The reports from Kiel lay scattered on his desk, ink smeared by his shaking hands. The word mutiny appeared again and again, underlined and red. He read it as if by staring long enough he could erase it. But even the Führer could not deny what had happened. His voice broke the silence, hoarse and bitter. "The Navy has betrayed me," he said. "They are all cowards." No one dared to answer. Around him, the bunker had become a tomb of silence and fear. Officers whispered of surrender, but no one spoke the word aloud. Hitler would rather burn Germany to ashes than see it fall into enemy hands. And so, while the world outside collapsed, he planned his own destruction. Back in Kiel, the rebellion's remnants were fading fast. The Gestapo had taken control of the docks. Bodies of mutineers lay where they had fallen, unburied, nameless. Those who survived were rounded up, beaten, and sent to makeshift holding cells in the basements of naval offices. Bauer was among them. His face was swollen, his uniform ripped, but he refused to speak. When the interrogator demanded names, he said nothing. When they asked why he had done it, he simply answered, because someone had to. For that, he was sentenced to death. But the execution never came. 2 days later, British forces reached the outskirts of Kiel. The sound of their tanks thundered through the city, and the Gestapo fled in panic. The war was over before the sentence could be carried out. When the British entered the harbor, they expected resistance. They found none. The German ships lay still, their guns unmanned, their flags lowered. The surviving sailors stood on deck, heads bowed, weapons discarded. A British officer later wrote in his report, "It was the strangest sight I have ever seen. The enemy did not surrender. They simply stopped being the enemy." Among the prisoners brought in that day was Matthias Kessler. He was found in the ruins of a church, unconscious, his radio beside him. The British doctor who examined him noted that his hands were badly burned, likely from damaged equipment. When asked who he was, he only replied,
No one.
But when Allied intelligence began reviewing intercepted signals, they discovered the broadcast sent from Kiel days earlier, the message that had told them the German fleet would not fight. The signal was traced back to Kessler's transmitter. Without it, the Allies might have launched a full assault on the naval ports, costing thousands of lives on both sides. He never spoke of it. After the war, a small number of surviving mutineers were quietly released. Most faded into anonymity, blending into the ruins of post-war Germany. The new government, desperate to rebuild, had no desire to publicize stories of rebellion within its own ranks. The word mutiny became taboo, buried beneath decades of silence. But the truth endured. In diaries, in whispers, in the memories of the men who had been there. Years later, in 1959, a British historian researching naval archives uncovered fragments of coded messages from the last days of the war. One caught his attention, a brief unsigned transmission repeating a single phrase in German. Die Flotte wird nicht kämpfen. The fleet will not fight. It was dated April 28, 1945. By that time, Hitler was already preparing for his final act in Berlin, and the navy he had once called the pride of the Reich was gone, not destroyed by enemy bombs, but undone by its own conscience. In the end, the rebellion at Kiel changed nothing in the course of history, and yet it changed everything. It did not stop the fall of Germany. It did not save the Reich. But it proved, in the dying hours of a monstrous war, that even among the ranks of those who had served it, humanity had not been completely extinguished. In a war defined by blind obedience, a handful of men had dared to disobey. And though the world forgot their names, the sea did not.
Because somewhere in the cold waters of the Baltic, the wrecks of those ships still rest, silent monuments to the night when the German Navy turned against its master, and the echo of their defiance drifted into history like a final breath of freedom. The war was over. The guns fell silent, the banners of the Reich were torn down, and the echoes of 1,000 battlefields faded into memory. But for those who had lived through the mutiny, the sailors who had chosen defiance over blind loyalty, the end of the war did not bring peace. It brought silence, a silence heavier than the roar of cannons. In the shattered ruins of Germany, survivors drifted through the chaos like ghosts. Some returned to their families, if they still had any. Others wandered from town to town, hiding their past, pretending to be ordinary men who had simply followed orders. To admit to mutiny was still dangerous. In a country struggling to rebuild its identity, heroes and traitors were often the same men, separated only by who wrote the history books. Matthias Kessler never spoke publicly of what he had done. The British released him after months of questioning when it became clear that his signal had saved lives. But in the new world that followed, there was no place for men like him, men who had fought not for victory, but for conscience. He moved to Lübeck, working as a mechanic at a small shipyard by the Baltic Sea. Those who met him described him as quiet, polite, but distant. He rarely spoke of the past, and when asked about the war, he would simply shake his head and say, "It was madness." On cold evenings, he would walk to the edge of the harbor and stare out at the horizon, where the wrecks of the old ships still lay beneath the waves. Sometimes fishermen said they saw him whispering to the sea, as if speaking to ghosts. Otto Bauer, too, survived. He spent several years in a British prisoner camp before being released in 1948. He returned to Kiel, now a city rebuilt from ashes. He lived alone, working on the docks until old age. In 1963, he was found dead in his small apartment, a faded naval photo still pinned to the wall. His crew, smiling, unaware of what awaited them. On the back of the photo were 4 words, written in his own hand. We chose to live.
For decades, no one spoke of the mutiny. Official records called it an isolated breakdown in command. The archives of the Kriegsmarine were sanitized, the truth buried under layers of bureaucracy and shame. But history, like the tide, has a way of returning what we tried to hide. In 1987, a German historian named Dr. Lucas Reinhardt uncovered a sealed box in the Federal Archives in Koblenz. Inside were radio logs, interrogation transcripts, and a handwritten note dated April 28, 1945, the day of Kessler's final broadcast. The note read, "Transmit immediately. The fleet will not fight. If this is my last act, let it be for those who still remember what it means to be human." The discovery reignited interest in the forgotten rebellion. Newspapers called it the mutiny that died in silence. Television crews came to Kiel, filming documentaries about the ships still rusting at the bottom of the harbor. For the first time, the names of the mutineers were spoken aloud: Matthias Kessler, Otto Bauer, Franz Miller, and others who had vanished into history. But more than the names, it was their message that lingered. A reminder that even in a regime built on fear and obedience, there were still moments of resistance, small, quiet acts of courage that refused to be erased. One journalist later wrote, "They did not win, they did not survive, but they remembered how to say no, and in that they found freedom." In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a small ceremony was held at the harbor in Kiel. The sea was calm, the sky gray. A handful of elderly men stood beside a memorial stone, their coats flapping in the wind. One of them, his hands trembling, placed a small metal badge on the stone, the insignia of the Kriegsmarine. The badge had been broken in half. The inscription on the memorial read simply, "To those who refused the last order."
It was not grand. It was not celebrated. But for those who understood, it was enough. Today, few remember the details of those final days. The names of the ships, the codes, the orders, all fade like ink on wet paper. But what remains is the truth that no regime, no matter how powerful, can command the conscience of every man. The German Navy's secret mutiny did not change the outcome of the war, but it revealed something deeper, a flicker of humanity in a sea of darkness. And as the years pass, the waves continue to wash against the rusting hulls of the lost fleet. The sea keeps their secret, but not their silence. Because if you stand on the docks of Kiel on a quiet night, when the wind is right, you can almost hear it, the whisper of steel, the echo of voices carried on the tide, the murmur of men who chose to live instead of die for madness. The war ended. The Reich fell.